A cloak snaps once in a violent wind, and then the man wearing it is simply gone. In the entire Hebrew Bible, only one prophet is ever recorded as having done what happened next. He did not grow old and die. He was never buried. There is no tomb, no grave, no body ever recovered. There is only a whirlwind, a chariot of fire, and a single terrified witness who watched every second of it. His name was Elijah, and long before that whirlwind, there was a career that made him the most feared and most hated man in the entire kingdom. Israel's king had married a foreign queen determined to replace the God of Israel with her own storm god, Baal, and to kill every prophet who dared to resist her. Baal was worshipped as the very god of rain and storm, which made the drought Elijah was about to call down a direct challenge on Baal's own supposed home ground. Elijah walked in and told the king that not one drop of rain would fall again until he himself said so. Then he vanished into the wilderness. For a while, he survived on bread that ravens carried to him at a hidden desert brook, until even that brook ran dry in the drought he himself had called down. Next he was sent to a foreign widow with almost nothing left, one last handful of flour and a little oil, enough for a final meal before she and her son starved. He told her to feed him first, and promised her jar of flour and jug of oil would not run out until the drought ended. They never did. Later, that same widow's son stopped breathing. Elijah carried the boy's body to an upper room, stretched himself over him 3 times, and cried out for his life to return. It did. It was the first time in the entire Hebrew Bible that anyone had ever been recorded coming back from the dead at all. A man who could raise the dead, and yet the story insists his own death is the one thing that never happened to him at all. 3 years into the drought, Elijah finally summoned the queen's own prophets to a mountain, for a contest that would settle which God was real once and for all. 450 prophets of Baal came, against one single man, in front of a crowd that had gathered from across the entire kingdom to watch. They built an altar and pleaded with Baal from morning until evening. No fire came, no matter how they screamed or cut themselves in desperation. Elijah rebuilt a ruined altar to his own God, then, almost mockingly, drenched it in water 3 separate times until the trench around it overflowed. He asked for fire, and fire fell, consuming the offering, the wood, the stones, and even the water pooled in the trench. The crowd fell to the ground in terror. There was no question left of coincidence or trickery, since Elijah had deliberately soaked everything first, removing any possibility of a hidden spark or an ordinary blaze. It was the greatest triumph of his career. You would think a man who had just called down fire from the sky would fear absolutely nothing after that. Instead, the very next day, when the queen swore to have him killed by morning, he simply ran, alone, into the desert. He collapsed under a solitary tree and asked God to just let him die, the same man who had raised a child from death now begging to be allowed his own. An angel woke him twice, left him bread and water, and told him only to eat, because the journey ahead of him was still too great. On that strength alone, he walked 40 days and 40 nights into the wilderness, to the same mountain where Moses had once met God face to face. It was the exact same number of days Moses himself had once fasted on that mountain, centuries earlier, and Elijah surely knew it. God did not appear in the violent wind that split the mountains, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire that followed after. He came instead in something the old translations call a still, small voice. It was in that silence, not in any of the spectacle, that Elijah received his next and strangest task: go back and choose the man who will finish what you started. That man was found behind a plough, in an ordinary field, driving 12 yoke of oxen through the dirt like any other farmer that morning. His name was Elisha. Elijah walked up without a word and threw his own cloak over the young farmer's shoulders. Nothing more needed to be said. Elisha understood exactly what the gesture meant. He slaughtered his own oxen, burned his plough for firewood, fed the town, and walked away from the only life he had ever known. From that day on, Elisha became Elijah's servant and shadow, pouring water over his hands, learning at his side through kings, famines, and miracles, for years. He watched his master confront kings, outrun armies, and call down judgment on entire royal houses, absorbing lessons no ordinary apprenticeship could ever have taught him. Neither man spoke of it often, but both of them seemed to sense that Elijah's time in the world was no longer unlimited. Then, one ordinary morning, Elijah rose and said it was time to travel to Bethel. Elisha, without hesitation, refused to be left behind. At Bethel, a company of local prophets pulled Elisha aside and asked in a whisper, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master from over you?" He already knew. He asked them to be silent about it, and once again refused to leave his master's side, even for a moment. The exact same warning came again at Jericho, from a different company of prophets, and Elisha gave the exact same answer a second time. Jericho was already one of the oldest inhabited cities on earth by that point, its walls rebuilt and fallen more than once across 1,000 years of history. 3 separate times along that final road, Elijah tested him, telling him to stay behind. 3 separate times, Elisha said the same unshakable line. "As the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." 50 more prophets followed at a careful distance, watching from a hillside, as the 2 men walked on together toward the banks of the Jordan River. At the water's edge, Elijah rolled up his own cloak and struck the river with it. The water split cleanly in 2, and the pair crossed on dry ground, exactly as Moses and Joshua once had before them. It was the 3rd time in the nation's entire history that the very same river had parted for someone carrying that same authority. On the far bank, with 50 watchers still straining to see across the water, Elijah finally turned to Elisha and asked him one last question. "Ask what you want me to do for you, before I am taken away from you." Elisha did not ask for wealth, comfort, or even safety. He asked for a double portion of Elijah's own spirit, the inheritance normally reserved only for a firstborn son. In effect, he was asking to be recognized, formally and publicly, as Elijah's true heir, the one who would carry the mission forward once his master was gone. Elijah told him he had asked for a hard thing, one that was not entirely his own to give. But he did not refuse. Instead, he offered a single, uncertain condition. "If you see me when I am taken from you, it will be granted to you. If you do not see it, it will not be." Everything now rested on one single, uncontrollable moment. Would Elisha actually see it happen, or would he look away at exactly the wrong instant? They kept walking together and talking, as if it were any other ordinary day on the road. Then, without a single word of warning, the sky itself seemed to tear open. A chariot of fire and horses of fire tore between them, and in one violent instant the 2 men were ripped apart from one another. Elisha watched, frozen and unable to look away, as Elijah was swept upward inside a whirlwind, rising straight toward the open sky. My father," he cried out, "the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." And then, in an instant, there was nothing left above him but empty sky. He had seen it, every second of it, from the very first flame to the very last. The condition had been met. In grief, and in the ancient custom of mourning, Elisha tore his own robe down the middle with both hands. Then something on the ground caught his eye. Elijah's cloak had fallen from the sky, the very same cloak once thrown over Elisha's shoulders in a farmer's field, years before. He picked it up off the ground. He carried it back to the river's edge, alone now for the first time, and did the only thing left that could prove what had just happened to him. "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" He struck the water with the fallen cloak, the exact same way his master had done only minutes before. The river split again, exactly as it had before. The 50 watching prophets on the distant hillside saw it happen with their own eyes and understood immediately what it meant. "The spirit of Elijah now rests on Elisha," they said, and came down to bow before him. But some of them still could not quite accept that their old master was simply gone forever. They begged permission to send 50 of their strongest men into the hills, convinced the whirlwind must have simply set him down again somewhere nearby. Elisha told them plainly not to bother, but they pressed him so persistently that he finally relented just to end their asking. For 3 entire days, those 50 men searched every ravine, cave, and hillside they could reach in the wilderness around the Jordan. They found absolutely nothing. No body, no grave, no torn clothing, no sign whatsoever that he had ever come back down to earth at all. Of every prophet, king, and patriarch named across the entire Hebrew Bible, only one other person is ever described this same way, a man named Enoch, generations earlier, of whom Scripture says only that he walked with God, and then was not, for God took him. Enoch's account is barely 5 verses long, tucked into a long list of ordinary deaths, which makes its sudden break in the pattern even more noticeable to anyone reading closely. 2 men, out of every single human being named across the entire Old Testament. Neither one was ever given a recorded death. Neither one was ever given a grave to be found. And Elijah's story did not end with a search party going home empty-handed. His name kept returning, again and again, long after his own generation had passed away. Centuries after that whirlwind, the very last words written by the Hebrew prophets close on a single, startling promise about him. Whoever arranged the order of those books seems to have wanted his name to be one of the last things a reader encountered before the prophetic voice fell silent for generations. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet, before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. A man taken 30 generations earlier was promised to return. That single promise reshaped an entire faith's expectations for the future. To this day, some Jewish households still set an empty chair and an untouched cup of wine at their Passover table, waiting. Jewish tradition beyond scripture grew even further around him, with folk tales of Elijah appearing in disguise to the poor and the desperate, testing hearts, and vanishing again just as suddenly as he first left. In many of those later stories he arrives as an unnamed beggar at a stranger's door, and only after he is gone does anyone realize who their guest truly was. Centuries later still, on a mountain in Galilee, 3 of Jesus' closest followers reportedly witnessed him transfigured in blinding light, speaking with 2 other men. One was Moses. The other, unmistakably, was Elijah. The man who never had a funeral appeared again, centuries after his own whirlwind, still fully present within the sacred story his people kept telling. And when people later asked whether a wilderness preacher named John was somehow Elijah himself returned, Jesus gave an answer that reached all the way back to that riverbank centuries before. He said John had come in the spirit and the power of Elijah, fulfilling, in an entirely new form, the very promise made at the closing words of the old prophets. It was not a literal reincarnation, Jesus made clear, but the same fierce calling and the same fire returning through an entirely different man. Almost every other name recorded in scripture ends the exact same way every human life does. A number of years, and then, eventually, a burial. Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, every king and patriarch across 2 entire testaments, all of them given a final resting place somewhere on record. Elijah's account was written differently on purpose, and everyone who copied it down for the next 3,000 years kept the difference perfectly intact. No illness, no burial, no grave for pilgrims to visit, and no bones for anyone to ever recover, then or now. Instead, only a whirlwind, a chariot of fire, one watching successor, and a mantle left behind as the sole remaining proof that any of it had ever truly happened. That is the detail worth sitting with. Not simply that a prophet vanished, but that scripture went out of its way, again and again, to insist he never actually died at all. In a book built almost entirely around the certainty of death, from Adam onward, one single man was allowed to walk straight through it, still breathing, still himself, taken rather than buried. A prophet walked into a whirlwind nearly 3,000 years ago, and his people have spent every generation since, still quietly waiting for him to walk back out of one.